In the late afternoon, our road converged with several other tracks in an area of oak trees dotted with small houses inside the forest. The narrow roads were crammed with traffic and people, all heading west towards the north. South Autobahn. Basic military discipline had broken down in this area. There was nobody directing the traffic, and panzers, half-tracks, motorcycle, combinations and cars all scraped alongside each other as the final single road. Had to take all of the vehicles and people. The forest was dense overhead, but either side was more open country, and we could hear the sound of fighting from left and right as the troops on the flanks fought to keep the narrow route open. I began to see, among the roadside bushes, small shapes that fluttered in the breeze and trailed long threads. These were the epaulets, shoulder badges, and collar insignia of officers and NCOs who did not want to be captured with. The enemy knowing their rank, and they had torn their markings off and thrown them away. Almost all of these were the badges of regular Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe troops, gleaming dully in the light. I saw a few SS markings strewn by. The roadside the skull badge or the collar flashes, that would identify them as the Russians' worst enemies. However, most SS men were identifiable by their high-quality camouflage uniforms or by their forearm tattoos which contained their blood group. For the SS, the only choice was to get to the west. The alternative was simply death. For years, they had sown destruction in the east, and now the enemy had them in an iron claw. Slowly, we made our way towards the western edge of the forest, and the great Autobahn road beyond. We managed to take some gasoline from a stranded truck full of Luftwaffe officer cadets, and we had to hold these boys back at gunpoint while we poured their cans of fuel into our panzers to gain another 10 kilometers of movement. This was the law of the Kessel. He who could take what he needed had to take it. The Luftwaffe cadets stood cursing and swearing vengeance on us as we left them behind. As we approached the edge of the trees, a rocket bombardment began to smash into the rear of our column. The Katyusha rockets tore down through the oaks, smacking from one great trunk to another, setting the branches on fire and raining a burning liquid down onto the people there. It was essential that we leave this forest, or everyone here would be consumed within hours. From the front of the column, an SS panzer man came running beside the road, calling for all panzers or armor to move to the front. Behind him, a squad of SS infantry were moving along the road, pushing all unarmored vehicles or foot traffic to one side to let the panzers through. The capo's panther and mine made our way forward in answer to the call, crushing cars or carts which had not been moved aside. We even had to bulldoze aside a complete 88mm gun, which was stuck on its trailer in a crater, blocking the path. Behind us, from out of the smoke of the burning trees, there appeared a convoy of Hetzers, the little self-propelled tracked guns that were fast and low, lightly armored, but useful to have in any situation. It was amazing to think that the complete Hetzer vehicle, at barely 16 tons, weighed less than the turret on a King Tiger, which I believe weighed 18 tons. How many more Hetzers could Germany have built for the cost of the 500 King Tigers, which we produced in total in our factories? 2,000 Hetzers, or 3,000. What effect would this have had on the war? Such questions can lead to all manner of calculations and alternatives. We were joined also by a Panzer of a tank training regiment, crewed by youths led by an experienced NCO, who stood in his turret hatch in an old-style black Panzer tunic, as if he was rolling into Poland at the start of this whole war. With this clutch of vehicles, we moved up to the head of the column and dispersed among dense trees along the edge of an old gravel quarry. The quarry was full of wounded who were set out on the ground among the stones, and these men called to us pitifully not to leave them behind. I turned my head away and tried to shut out the sounds as we panzer crews assembled, with the SS men and moved quickly to the edge of the forest itself. 3 king tigers were concealed here, their massive outlines shrouded. In nets and branches, these were not the vehicles we had come through Halbe with, but from the 10 TSS Panzers, which was reduced to this number as its entire strength. The unit was commanded by a Waffen SS major with a bandage around his head and burn marks on his face. The SS had grim, clenched faces, as befitted men who were seeking to escape certain death at the hands of their captors, and their dilated, darkened eyes suggested that they were drawing strength from their supplies of cognac and amphetamine. The SS had set up a binocular periscope here, and through it we could survey the edge of the woods, a short stretch of land, and then a dark ribbon, cutting through the landscape from north to south. "That is the Autobahn," the SS major said. "Beyond that there is the railroad, and then the 12th Army." "Where are the Reds?" the capo asked him. "There is less bombardment out there in the open." "I think the Reds are waiting," the SS man said. "They came up this road on their way to Berlin 3 days ago. Almost all their forces are centered there too, the north, but they must expect we will break out somewhere here. We captured a Red officer this morning who told us that they are bringing more armored units down the Autobahn from Berlin tonight. They plan to fortify the Autobahn and make sure that nobody can cross it. See, the Autobahn goes through a cutting which would be perfect to defend. If the Reds build up in strength there, we will never get past this point." "Where is this prisoner?" the capo asked. "He is dead now. The information is accurate. We made sure of that." The SS man lit a cigarette. He grinned suddenly. "American cigarettes," he explained. "I have a contact who acquired a whole truckload in the Ardennes. Here, have one." Everybody have one. A red jabot flew over the tree line, firing rockets to the right of us. Nevertheless, we all took a cigarette and inhaled the smoke. The tobacco was fresh and fragrant in a way that I remembered from my first cigarette before the war. It was rich and, what was the word? Quality, one of the Hetzer men said. "This is quality tobacco." "This is what life is like under the Americans," the SS major said. "And the Americans will need men such as us to rebuild this country. I don't know about you, but I can speak some English." He did not flinch as more red planes screamed overhead, firing cannon through the trees, empty cannon shell cases. From these planes fell through the branches and landed around us. "What is the plan for crossing the Autobahn?" the Panzer IV man asked. "I assume that with your heavy panzers you will be in the lead." "Yes," the major nodded, looking us all in the eye. "We will cross at dusk. My 3 king tigers will go out and cross first. We will hold open the way for the columns behind us." He gestured with his cigarette into the forest. "For all these columns to cross the Autobahn. But we also need screening panzers to move north and south of the crossing point. Those panzers will prevent enemy armor from approaching and disrupting the crossing. I want the 3 Hetzers, and 1 Panther to the south, and the Panzer IV and the other Panther to the north, each grouped along the Autobahn cutting. My SS Panzer Grenadiers will accompany you, and there are still infantry units in the columns who will fight. Some of the civilians are well armed now, so they can be useful to us as well." In this way, we will open the crossing, and in darkness our whole columns can cross at speed. After that, we must drive west without stopping. I repeat, we will not stop. You must keep up or be left behind for the Russians." He grinned suddenly. "And then I will see you on the Elbe. We will be prisoners, but we will have plenty of cigarettes, my friends." The capos stood on the edge of the gravel quarry, staring down at the doomed, wounded on their grimy blankets, men who knew they were being abandoned. "2 more battles," he said. "The Autobahn and then the rail line. For me, there is no choice in the matter. I must not be taken prisoner by the Reds. My family are in the West, and any future that I have is in the West. I cannot do 10 or 20 years in a Soviet prison in Siberia. I cannot do it. And if we are wounded? That is a risk I shall take. Look, Faust, if you want to stay back, if you want to surrender or cross the Autobahn with the column behind us, that is. Understandable. The war is almost over, and I cannot force you to fight. See here. Look at all this. He pointed to a tree on the edge of the quarry. A large number of German insignia had been thrown here, hundreds of epaulets and collars dangling in. The breeze. Among them were many German tunic badges of the eagle with the swastika. The broad silver wings of the eagle were fluttering idly among the leaves, trailing their ripped-off threads, the myriad swastikas discarded like omens of bad luck. "You see, it is over," the capo said, "but my life must not be over, for the sake of my children. For you, Faust, perhaps it is different. You have no family, do you?" I took from my pocket the crumpled photograph of the unknown girl that had been with me from my first day in the Kessel and showed it to him. "I will come with you to the West," I said. "You're a strange fellow, Faust. You're half killer and half romantic." "Thank you, sir." I took an amphetamine tablet and swallowed it down with a gulp of schnapps, and finally squeezed the last of an ampule of morphine into my mouth and swallowed that. I waited a few seconds for the combined effect to hit me. I jumped onto the turret as if I was weightless and took command of the Panther through the headphones. In the side of my vision, I could see the massed ranks of the abandoned wounded lying in the quarry floor, and I forced myself not to look at them. The headphones on my ears blocked out, partly, the sound of their cries. Before my engine started, I heard, nevertheless, a series of single shots, the impacts coming one after the other at irregular intervals. I could not stop myself looking back. Some of the wounded troops were committing suicide. A pistol was passing from one hand to another, being fumbled among the blood-stained clothing. The men's desperate open mouths sought the muzzle of the gun like so many helpless chicks seeking their food. I was to seal off the southern Autobahn with the 3 Hetzers and a mobile flak on a Famo half-track, which had a quadruple 20mm cannon. This was quite a strong group of vehicles for such a task, and we were accompanied by 2 Hanemags of SS Panzer Grenadiers who would act to secure the crossing and then be replaced by Wehrmacht as the SS moved west. All in all, this was a respectable battle group, and I felt confident that we could hold the crossing. Open in the early stages, provided that more armor came up from inside the Kessel as the night progressed. We moved out towards the Autobahn as the sun set. The western sky, towards which we were striving with such hope, was streaked with red. The land around the road was scattered with the debris of the Russians' advance north to Berlin, which had cleaved our forces in two and sealed the Kessel from the west. In the preceding days, a ruined T-34 and a Panzer I-4 were jammed together, burned out and wrecked. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft lay on its back, its 2 pilots dead in the glass cabin. Shell craters were filled with the bodies of Soviets, Wehrmacht, and civilians, their jumbled faces staring up with a waxen pallor. As soon as our tracks bit into the dry ground here and threw up dust, and an aircraft appeared in the sky overhead. This was a Russian lame duck type, the little biplanes used for spotting and nuisance bombing. Our flak vehicle drove it, away with bursts of tracer which spiraled up luminously in the gray light. But not before the plane had dropped a white parachute flare marking our location. In this sinister glow, I saluted the capo, as his Panther and the old Panzer. 4 moved off to guard the northern flank of the crossing point, while I moved south with the Hetzers. As soon as we approached the Autobahn itself, we came under fire from the far side. A red tracer round flashed from a clump of trees and hit the Hetzer, which was next to me. The range was less than a kilometer, and the force of the round lifted the whole top of the Hetzer's body from the hull, sending it up into the air in front of me. The little vehicle caught fire immediately and continued, rolling forward for some distance, with its crew burning within the open hull. My gunner responded to the attack with a high explosive round which blew aside some of the trees where the enemy was located. I could make out a huge, block-shaped machine equipped with a massive gun, an SU tank destroyer. These colossal machines were nothing more than mobile steel fortresses, but their battleship guns could be fatal to any panzer in their path. To my north, the two SS King Tigers broached the Autobahn and came to a halt straddling the Black Road and its lines of wreckage. They engaged the SU at a range of about 1.5 kilometers, firing together across the plain. In moments, the SU was hit with a strike that knocked its massive gun mantle off to one side, and smoke began to coil from its hull. With the two remaining Hetzers, my Panther II came onto the Autobahn, and we positioned ourselves along it with the Panther on the left, and the two surviving Hetzers staggered on the right. Our two Hanemags of SS men leaped from their transports and took up positions beside the road with heavy machine guns and Panzerfausts. Dusk was gathering, but overhead the drifting parachute flare cast a light similar to dawn. Fortunately, a strong breeze was carrying it away from us to the southwest. I surveyed the long, straight Autobahn through the cupola periscopes, trusting to the King Tigers on my right to guard our rear as they broke through the red lines. The landscape was being lit by flashes and bursts of fire as they engaged the armor they were encountering. I took a quick look in that direction, and with the drugs affecting my mind, I was transfixed at what I saw. On the great open plain, one King Tiger stood out in the glow of dusk, silhouetted against the skyline. It was immobilized with its massive tracks, twisted around, and one drive wheel lying beside it. Unmoving, though, it continued to fire as its comrade Tiger moved ahead, covering the other Tiger, against a group of SU destroyers which were approaching the immobile Tiger. Crew seemed determined to use all their ammunition, and were shooting at a rapid pace, again and again, each shot illuminating the huge, doomed machine. I saw one of its rounds streak across the plain and blow the hatches off. One of the SU machines, the red destroyer, emitted a pall of smoke and tipped into a crater, spinning around to expose its flank. The Tiger pierced it through the side with another round, which exited upward through the engine grills, and rose perhaps 100 meters into the air, the tracer still glowing. The crew of that SU began to clamber out, but they were caught by a horizontal burst from one of our flak half-tracks, cutting them to pieces where they stood. The King Tiger engaged in a death duel with the two remaining SU guns. The Reds slowly shot the great Panzer to pieces, one round knocking off its running gear and causing the wheels to spin wildly over the ground. Another shell exploded on the turret, sending the cupola off into the air. Still the King Tiger kept firing as its comrade Panzer pushed forward to the west, shooting up the resistance that it was encountering there. The stricken Tiger wreathed in smoke and, with its wheels and tracks destroyed, fired on, immobilizing one of the SUs by exploding a high explosive shell low on its front plate. I could see the SU's drive wheel spinning, but the tracks were separated and it was unable to move. The other destroyer shot up our King Tiger with slow, repeated rounds, one that hit the front plate and deflected off, then another which hit the gun mantle and deflected down onto the hull in a puff of metal fragments. The SU prowled to the flank of the Tiger, even as our Panzer sought to traverse its turret. Onto the enemy, two final shots blew off the Tiger's engine covers, sending burning gasoline over the hull, and then punched a hole clean through the side of the turret. The Tiger's hatches flew off in trails of sparks. One lone crewman climbed out and stood for a moment on top of the turret as the flames spread over the Panzer around him. Then the whole machine erupted in a flash of gasoline flames and sent out a ragged starburst of detonating ammunition and fuel. Behind it, a dark mass of German infantry began to pour across the Autobahn, so many that the SU destroyer could only stand and fire at the living. Column infantry moved towards the monster, those men remaining brave. Enough to take on a red panzer, determined perhaps to destroy this one by bombs or Panzerfausts. Herr Feldwebel, in front of us. I had been negligent in my drugged state. I had been mesmerized by the sight of the doomed King Tiger, that I had taken my eyes away from the Autobahn to the south, in the gathering dusk but lit by the parachute flare. Drifting west, a number of machines were advancing on us along the dead, straight asphalt road. These were T-34s, I was sure, with the sloped front plates, and bulbous turrets of the 85mm gun type. They were about 1 kilometer from us, but starkly outlined as the flare dropped to earth behind them, showing up their exhaust fumes. To make up for my error, I was determined to be the first to knock one out, but I also saw the 2 Hetzers in front of me twitch from side to side as their drivers lined up the turretless machines with the track differential to align and aim their short 75mm guns at the enemy. I glanced at our ammunition rack below the turret. It held barely a dozen rounds of armor-piercing in all and half a dozen high-explosive, plus 1 round in the breech and 1 in the loader's brawny hands. I told the gunner to fire when he was sure of a strike. The Russian panzers fired first, while still moving, and we took an impact on our front plate which rang through the hull with a deafening echo. Another round went straight past us, towards the mass of infantry behind who were breaking out across the Autobahn, and a third slammed into one of the empty SS Hanomag's, splitting open the half-track and sending it spinning over. On its roof, trailing flames. My gunner fired, and the tracer flew directly onto the leading red panzer. There was a puff of debris on its turret front, and then the whole machine, traveling at perhaps 30 kph, span around on its axis, with flames shooting from its hull hatches. With its ammunition exploding, it reared up and plowed off the Autobahn, crashing into a culvert and shuddering with explosions. Behind it, though, a whole pack of T-34s were taking its place, the lead ones firing as they raced towards us, and the ones behind, I could just make out as the parachute flare died away, loaded with infantry holding on behind the turrets. I shouted orders to my gunner, with such a pack of armor coming directly towards us. We were a stable firing platform, shooting at targets which were getting constantly closer and larger, rather than moving laterally. The T-34s perceived us through their sights in the same way, but their rolling motion, even over the flat surface of the Autobahn, impaired their firing accuracy. They were obviously well stocked with ammunition, though, and kept firing as they advanced, each shot causing a slipstream of smoke, through which the panzers charged on us. They had not seen the Hetzers beside the road, I realized, and in a second, our 2 small destroyer machines opened fire with their 75mm guns. The range was less than 500 meters, and their combined shots blew the tracks off one T-34, causing it to veer sideways and collide with its comrade. That second Red Panzer was carrying a squad of troops on its rear, and I saw the soldiers being thrown off by the impact, tumbling onto the asphalt, while the T-34s that followed simply drove over their bodies without slowing or swerving. The tiny size of the Hetzer was its greatest strength, low and compact, difficult to see in the dusk, but with enough punch to halt a T-34 in its tracks. The Red Panzers began to fire high explosive at the points where the Hetzers were, concealed, trying to flush them out. As they did so, they slowed down to steady their aim. Inside the Panther turret, seconds passed in a fog of explosive fumes and sweat, breathing and cursing as my gunner laid his aim. Then the turret reverberated with the shot, and the shell case clunked into the collection box, even as our round traveled straight into the driver's visor of a leading Russian Panzer. I had been a driver myself, and I knew the damage that would cause. The decapitated hull man, the red-hot fragments smashing around the interior, slicing, and setting fire to whatever it hit. That T-34 slowed suddenly, its rear deck rising, up into the air, and then crashing down as the panzers behind it steered around. The wreck. They closed up in front of it, and we had to fire again. We wasted a valuable round, which bounced off a T-34 turret and smashed into another T-34 which was carrying infantry. These troops were knocked off. The tank as the deflecting shell cut through them, and again the panzers behind, ran straight over the men as they fell onto the road. But where they died, it seemed that more red panzers carrying troops closed the gap. It seemed that, even if every last round of ours found its mark, it would never be sufficient to hold back the red numbers charging against us. This was the force that we had provoked with our attack on the east. A force with endless resources, endless men, and an endless desire for vengeance. This was what we had created, and this was what would destroy us now, us and the thousands of people swarming across the Autobahn behind us. We fired again and took a hit on our turret that smashed onto the gun, mantle, and made the breech of our 75mm twitch in the impact. I heard the round deflect downward and hit the top of the hull over the hull crew's head. The driver and radio man heard it too, and let out a stream of relieved curses as the shell failed to penetrate the armor above them. The red panzers were on top of us then, literally driving into us, and a vicious, confused battle erupted in our sector of the Autobahn, while the 8 Kessel's occupants flooded across the road only a few hundred meters behind us. That was the Reds' objective, clearly, to smash through us and cause havoc. Among the foot traffic streaming out of the Kessel at last, my vision in the periscope was filled with the front turret of a T-34 that rammed straight into us, trying to bulldoze us aside. The impact made our entire hull recoil, but the red panzer came off worse, being thrown to one side, its turret and hull pointing away from us. My driver rotated us onto that panzer with the differential, while my gunner was lowering the gun elevation, and we fired at a range of barely 10 meters. I saw the shot punch through the backplate of the Soviet Panzer, splitting open the armor there so that I could see the engine, flashing with fire in its bay. Then the round exited out of the front of the T-34 and span away. What carnage had it caused inside? How many broken limbs and ripped bodies? The T-34 shuddered once and went still, starting to burn from the engine. Chaos was erupting around us. Someone had fired off red flares, and the lurid crimson light showed up. The landscape like a new sunset. The T-34s had found the Hetzers in their emplacements and were intent on destroying them. We fired on one red panzer. As it tried to crush a little Hetzer under its tracks with the big Russian tread links, scrabbling wildly on the Hetzer's roof, ripping off its hatches. Our round went through the exposed lower plate of the Red, and pieces of its hull sides were thrown off as the Panzer exploded with the Hetzer still trapped beneath it. Other T-34s had halted to disembark their infantry, and these riders were leaping off, outlined clearly in the red light, and surging past us towards the crossing point in our rear. The Waffen-SS men rose from their positions and confronted them, and although I could not hear the shouts over the din inside my Panther, I glimpsed Russian faces contorted with rage at finding the hated SS troops in their way. I saw a group of SS men firing from behind the remaining Hetzer, calmly, operating a MG-42 held over one man's shoulder, tearing down the Red infantry line as it charged onward. The Russians were cut to pieces where they ran, but a T-34 blew up both the Hetzer and the MG team with repeated rounds of high explosive. The tank destroyer was blown onto its side, crushing the SS men. Around it, its tracks running at speed as its transmission raced wildly, blazing. Gasoline exploded from its rear deck and flooded the ground for many meters. We were isolated now, with just our Panther and a handful of Panzer Grenadiers against the Red Mass, against a remaining trio of T-34s racing. Past us in the light of the flares, intent on smashing the Kessel breakout. 1. Ivan Panzer was hit in the side by a Panzerfaust as it rolled forward, which blew, opened the front hull, and caused an explosion that sent the tracks whirling into the scarlet-tinted air. The troops that fired that rocket were immediately crushed. Under the next Red Panzer, which ran them over and sent their bodies shooting, out dismembered from the rear of its tracks. We hit the second T-34 with an armor-piercing round as it moved away from us, knocking a great scab of armor from its turret. Inside, I could see through the periscopes the Red crew. Flailing as their compartment caught fire, the men struggling to climb from the turret but falling back into the flames. The last T-34 span around to face us, opting to finish my Panther before. Advancing on the crossing site, we fired first, but our round deflected off his front plate and disappeared into the air. His shot on us hit my radio man's gun. Point in the hull where the ball-mounted MG-34 was located under a curve of armor plate. My radio man screamed and then went silent, and before we could afford the time to attend to him, we fired on the T-34 at a range of 20 meters, putting a round between the gun mantle and the turret ring. The turret jolted and the gun slumped. The hull hatch opened and sparks shot out. I could see that the Panzer was burning inside, and in a moment 2 crewmen came out. Of the hatch, one after the other, their uniforms on fire, but armed with a drum cylinder machine pistol. My sight of that was obscured by a human face, close up, right against the cupola periscope. It was an Asiatic Mongolian-type face, and in the red light, it was twisted into a mask of absolute hatred. Red infantry were climbing onto us, even as we fought their panzers. I ordered the driver to reverse, and as we lurched backward, I saw the Russian soldier's face disappear as he was thrown off the panzer in the momentum. I caught sight of his tumbling legs as he went, and then a flash as his. Grenades exploded on the ground. Our engine stalled, and the Panther filled with foul smoke so thick that we could barely see across the turret. Smoke coiled around the outside too, making external vision through the periscopes. Impossible. I threw aside the cupola hatch and put my shoulders up into the air. The Red fighters were all around us, and the SS men were grappling with them, fighting them to the death. I saw an SS man beat down 2 Red tank crews with an entrenching spade, then seize their machine pistol and turn it on. The other Russian infantry, the SS man was blown apart by a grenade, and the Reds swarmed on towards the breakout point. Below me, in the smoke-filled hull, my driver was trying to restart the engine. There was no sound at all from the radio man. I saw some of the Red infantry begin to retreat, followed by tracer and grenade flashes. Our men in the crossing point were beating them back, forcing them away from the thousands of people on foot, hurrying across the road. 1. Red soldier was pursued by 2 civilians, who shot the man down with a shotgun and a rifle, then stood over him and searched his pockets rapidly. Another wounded Russian dragged himself away, unarmed, until a civilian woman chasing after him shot him in the back with a pistol. All across the ground between us and the exodus over the Autobahn, such scenes were taking place, as the last of this initial Red attacking force was wiped out by the desperate Germans of all classes and arms. The crossing point had been kept open. Our engine started, and we rotated the hull again to face the southern Autobahn, where I expected more enemy panzers to appear. We opened all the hatches to ventilate the compartment, and then I shouted down for a report on our radio man. There was no answer, so I climbed down under the turret ring and craned my neck through the forward bulkhead to see the situation in the front hull. On the left, the driver was green-faced, holding his head up to the open hatch and gulping in mouthfuls of outside air. On the right, across the bulkhead, the radio man was sprawled in his seat with his head thrown back. a piece of. The T-34's armor-piercing round had entered the compartment through his machine gun port, destroying his gun mounting, and had come to a halt within. The radio man's chest, his whole rib cage was torn open, and inside, I realized as I leaned over to see a fragment of the conical projectile was embedded through his back into the steel bulkhead behind him. I opened the hatch above his head and asked the men to help me remove his body from the Panzer. The force that came to relieve us was not impressive. It consisted of a pair of Stugs, one with smoke pouring from its exhausts, a Panzer IV, and a single Panther. These were to guard both the north and south borders of the crossing point, together with two 88mm guns, towed by half-tracks and about 100 infantry. In a few hours, these units too would join the exodus west and be replaced by units from further back in the pocket, until the entire mass of men, civilians, and machines in the Kessel crept westward like a caterpillar, coiling itself up one step at a time, and then uncoiling as it moved. The mass of people and materiel moving across the Autobahn was colossal. In any minute, several hundred men, women, and children would emerge from the shadows of the heath, bunch up on the edge of the road, look quickly, left and right, as if checking for traffic, and then dash across, disappearing off. Towards the railroad line in the distance, the sparks and glow of exhausts moved. Among them, as motorcycles, half-tracks, and the few remaining cars and trucks made the crossing too. The Reds did not attack this point immediately with panzers or troops, but they began a bombardment, which burst in slow, random patterns across the Autobahn, scattering groups of people or sending vehicles flying end over end. Nobody knew where the next explosion would fall or whether they would be the next to be hit or if they would die or be left behind as wounded, like the many injured troops and civilians who were lying in the shadows on the grassland, crying out not to be abandoned. Our Panther rejoined the Kapo's Panther and the solitary Panzer IV. The old Panzer IV was screeching as it moved, and fell behind us slowly as its power began to fail. As we moved away from the road, I looked back and saw the Panzer being swallowed in the ranks of people trudging past it, where once they would have climbed up on it, begging for a ride. Now they seemed to know that. The vehicle was crippled, and they ignored it in their trek to the west. The Panzer IV commander, the old Panzer training man, came running after us, flagging us. Down. My fuel, he shouted. We have no spare fuel, I called down. I have barely enough for 10 kilometers. But I have plenty, he shouted. I have a full tank. We began to reverse back to his machine. The story was an interesting one. His training unit had been equipped with panzers which had been adapted to run on wood-burning carbon monoxide, stoves instead of gasoline. But for several months, gasoline had continued to be delivered, and they had amassed a small reserve. We quickly pumped out every drop of fuel from the Panzer IV tanks and split it between the Kapo's Panther and mine. It was not a large amount, but increased our range from 10 kilometers to 50 kilometers, enough in a straight line to cross the railroad and reach the Elbe. That was provided that we had no detours, climbed no hills, and made no bursts of speed in combat. I let the Panzer II's trainee panzer crew ride on my Panther's front plate, where the angle meant that only able-bodied people can hold on, and we took several walking wounded and civilians onto the hull top and deck. I put the training instructor himself in the empty radio man's compartment, crouching on the shattered seat, with an MP-40 and instructions to fire it through the broken gun mounting if needed. He seemed pleased enough with the arrangement. Then we headed west in the semi-darkness, among the stumbling foot columns and the random explosions of the shells. My gunner rested his face on the gun sight and went still. I suspected he was asleep, but I thought that he deserved it. I stood up in the cupola as we swayed over the heathland. I could see no sign of a counterattack by the Reds, although we were on the left flank, and the land in that direction was empty and open. That did not make me confident. On the contrary, it was as if the Russians were now allowing us to break out from the Kessel, permitting us to stream out into the western plain. But what choice did we have? The Kessel was a trap, a noose. If this open land was another trap, it had not yet snapped shut. In the darkness, which was broken only by the flash of explosions and fires, accidents happened. We passed a motorcycle that had been run over by a Panzer, the rider, and the machina visible for one instant in the light of a shell, burst mangled together in the ground. Any functioning motor vehicle that stopped was set upon and stripped of remaining fuel and ammunition. In this situation, with the scarcity of gasoline, horses were becoming more valuable. From my turret, I saw a pair of Wehrmacht troops descend on a civilian horse cart, cut the traces, and make off riding the horses, leaving the civilians to continue on foot. A senior Luftwaffe officer whose staff car had broken down threatened the driver of a horse-drawn field kitchen with a pistol, demanding a horse for himself. The officer was quickly disarmed by passing troops, and he began to make his way among the civilians, holding a suitcase. We passed a few isolated heathland houses, in some cases with occupants standing in the doorways, watching us mutely. In the light of the flares and burning vehicles along the road, we saw that some of these houses had fresh graves near them, and it was said that these were graves of civilians who had been killed by the Russians as they passed through in the days before. In the distance to the front, there were flashes and coils of tracer erupting into the sky, which I believed marked the point where the SS King Tigers were spearheading the movement to the west. As we grew closer, the movement of people faltered and slowed, as the vast bulk of the infantry were unwilling or unable to progress into combat. Many troops simply lay on the ground in the shadows, waiting for others to go forward and take part in the fighting for the advance. Among these were many officers who stood sullenly like children, their arms folded, refusing to give orders or to discipline their men. The civilian woman mucked and cursed these officers, calling out that their menfolk had fought like true Germans. Indeed, it became common to see armed groups of civilian women wearing helmets and clutching carbines or Russian machine pistols, seeming determined to defend themselves and their children too. The last. Leaving these miserable scenes behind, my Panther approached the head of the column, closer to the sounds of firing and explosions. The Capo's Panther was just in front of me, and following his exhausts, we entered a plateau crossed by ditches and hedgerows which we in the Panzers avoided carefully for fear of losing a track. In the dim light, we halted at a group of Panzer crews standing around a Jagdtiger, one of the massive self-propelled guns built on the King Tiger platform. The huge vehicle, like a bunker on tracks, was immobilized, emitting thick smoke, and men were siphoning off its remaining fuel. The Panzer crews greeted us with blank faces. By this stage there were no salutes and formalities, and the distinctions of rank were being lost. There was little interest, too, in the differences between the original units or regiments that we had come from. We were all there at that point in time, and we had to combine to maximize our chances of the breakthrough. "You have 2 Panthers," one of them said to us. "You will be useful. The railroad is ahead, but there's a blockade in front of it. If we can get over the railroad here, we drive straight on to the west. I know definitively that the 12th Army is there after the railroad waiting for us. We have had messengers coming through confirming this, but if we wait here, the Reds will simply destroy us at daylight." "But why attack the blockade itself?" the capo asked. "Why not bypass it?" "To the north and south are anti-tank ditches and flooded canals. These are things that our forces prepared to hold back the Russians, and now the Russians are using them. There are red panzers hidden up and down there too." "Ah!" We could find a way through all that, but it would take hours, and by then, the sun will be up. As soon as daylight comes, the Red Plains will cut us to pieces. The blockade is not our construction. The Soviets have built it in the past few days. Therefore, we believe it is a rushed piece of work, possibly not finished. We must break through it now. As we moved up to the front, the Jag Tiger was destroyed with a demolition charge, that massive machinery, the equivalent of 2 Panthers in. Steel and resources was simply left burning beside the road. The forces for attacking the railroad were our 2 Panthers, a remaining King Tiger, several Stugs, and some mobile 20mm flak panzers, which we called the Wirbelwind. These remarkable machines were quadruple 20mm cannon in, open turrets on a Panzerwerfer chassis, suitable for strafing ground targets as well as anti-aircraft fire. Their presence gave me confidence, but the sight of the infantry that was to accompany us was worrying. We had several dozen Fallschirmjäger, the elite forces that we could trust, to give their all. But they were supplemented with Volkssturm men and boys, the under 16s and over 50s, armed with Panzerfausts and carbines, completely untrained. There were several civilian police units too, and groups of panzer troops with no vehicles, artillerymen and flak gunners who had abandoned their guns in the breakout. Regular Wehrmacht troops were there, and a pioneer officer brought in another 50 or so from the column at gunpoint, ordering them to fight or face instant execution. This officer was backed up by a roaming gang, that is the word that came to my mind, of Kettenhund men, SS men and pioneer troops, vicious-looking marauders who radiated a desperation to elude the Russian trap. Forcing the press-ganged troops forward to join the others they dragged out one unwilling soldier, a lad of 18 or so, and executed him with a shot in the head. The others moved into the front line with grim faces. Dawn would come within an hour, and with it the red bomber planes, and the revelation of the extent of the great column behind us. The officers told me that there were 10 or 20,000 people bunched up here, waiting to cross the railroad to get to the west. Perhaps a quarter of them were civilians or walking wounded. Daylight surely would bring a level of destruction on a scale that so far we had not witnessed, even in the Kessel. There was no time for preparation or planning, with the aim of breaching. The blockade that guarded the railroad, the single SS King Tiger, lurched forward into the dark, with our Panthers following in an arrowhead formation, the Stugs beside us and the 2 Wirbelwind flak panzers following among the mix of infantry behind us. The railroad was on an embankment on the skyline, lit by the flames of burning vehicles. I could see its wide, straight line running left and right, and at its foot we had been told that the improvised blockade position consisted of bulldozed earth, logs, and sandbags. The greatest danger would come when we breasted the railroad itself. As we rose up over the railroad tracks, our lower hulls would be exposed to whatever was beyond for a few seconds, and an alert Russian PAK gunner could put a round through our forward transmission from below. Above the railroad line, the sky appeared to be tinted gray. Was dawn coming so early? The light suddenly brightened, and a long, intense beam shot up into the sky. Inside my Panther, even in the heat and fumes, we all laughed at the sight of that beam. The Russians had switched on an anti-aircraft searchlight. My God, that will protect them from the mighty Luftwaffe, the loader muttered, peering at the sight through his periscope. When was the last time you saw the Luftwaffe? The Panzer trainer called up from the hull. Was it Christmas or before? It seemed incredible that with their domination of the sky, the Reds would bother with an aerial searchlight, but then another beam joined the first, and then a third, and I could see that these were extremely powerful lights, sending long shafts of brilliant white light up into the smoky air above the railroad. The enemy strong point was still wrapped in shadows below it, as we closed to 500 meters, and there was no reaction from the blockade. The searchlight beams quivered, moved through the air, and then descended directly onto our panzers. Our laughter turned in a moment to shouts of pain and alarm. The lights were dazzling, brighter than any light I had seen before, surely more powerful than any normal anti-aircraft beam. They transformed the space in front of us into a wall of blinding fog in which it was impossible to make out any perspective or dimensions. My driver slowed, and I used the magnetic compass to keep him driving straight ahead, hoping that the other vehicles would do likewise. Fear gripped my stomach and made my hands shake uncontrollably. We were lit up like showground targets, blind and lost. Over the din of our engine, I heard another vehicle move close to us, collide with our flank, and then move off. Then the rapid, chattering fire of 20mm cannons told me that the Wirbelwind had moved in front and was shooting up at the searchlights. We entered a situation of complete anarchy and destruction, even by the standards of combat that I had seen in the East. We were hit by a pack round on our front plate, causing our transmission to shriek. At the same time, the blinding wall of light was cut in half, and I could dimly see flashes to our right. As the Wirbelwind blasted its cannon along the railroad embankment, my vision was impaired by the light, and my retina held brilliant shapes that prevented me focusing properly. My gunner cursed and shouted that he had the same problem. He could not focus on the gun sight. This was a new form of weapon from the Reds, a light so blinding that it prevented men from using their weapons. I ordered our driver to steer us to the right, out of the blinding light, into the area of darkness that the Wirbelwind had created. We were hit again by pack rounds, two slamming into our turret and blowing the periscope glass down onto me. I could now only see to the front, and there I thought I could make out a wrecked searchlight up on the embankment, and two more lights sweeping their beams randomly onto our forces. Machine gun and PK fire was coming from the blockade point, only a few hundred meters away. I saw the Wirbelwind's quadruple 20mm cannon tear a row of explosions along the top of the embankment, and then another one of the searchlights exploded in brilliant pieces and went dark. The remaining light continued operating, moving up and down the embankment and sweeping its blinding beam over our forces. We almost collided with the SS King Tiger, which was firing with a lowered gun onto the U blockade, advancing a few meters between each shot, unable to see anything else. I ventured my head up out of the cupola. The battle for the railroad was erupting in fits and starts as our men and machines threw themselves at the resistance points, cut down by the enemy guns, and dazzled by the powerful light. Two Stugs had been destroyed, and their crews were clambering out, shielding their eyes against the light. These men were picked off one by one as they tried to jump clear by machine guns firing from the blockade. One Stug exploded in flames, sending its tracks and wheels arching through the air for many meters. Our two Wirbelwinds were firing defiantly up onto the railroad line where the remaining searchlight was flashing its blinding cone back and forth over us. Among all this, our infantry were charging the Soviet blockade, running into the light and explosions in ragged groups. I gave instructions to my gunner and aimed our gun roughly at the blockade and fired our remaining high-explosive rounds into the sandbags and earthen walls. The timber and earth blew up, lifting the Red occupants into the air in a jumble of bodies and debris. A pack gun fired on us, the tracer deflecting off the front plate just a few meters below me, but then the Capo's Panther charged past us, firing at zero range, until he rammed the blockade itself with his bow. His Panther's tracks clawed madly at the mounds of earth, but sank into the debris that our shells had created, becoming stranded. Beside him, the King Tiger moved along the blockade, firing with his lowered gun into each aperture. I ordered my driver to ram the blockade, and we lurched onto the position as Red machine gunners shot at us from either side with their bullets, smacking off our armored hull. My driver used the differential expertly to rotate the Panzer and crush the dug-in positions, and then, on my order, we began to mount the embankment beyond the blockade. That last high-powered searchlight began to turn onto us, and I saw that. This was a device mounted on a T-34 chassis, with a huge projection disc bigger than any searchlight I had seen, even in the Reich. We reached the ridge of the embankment and rammed the machine before it turned its beam fully onto us, knocking it sideways. The TD-4 hull span off down the slope on the other side of the ridge, with the powerful beam now directed west towards the red lines. Perhaps this saved us, because a storm of tracer rounds flew up at us from the land beyond. But all the shots went wide. The searchlight Panzer caught fire and began to burn as its massive lens burst open and the light died. My Panther gripped the stones of the railroad line itself, and I felt the thump of each railroad girder as we passed over the top, and then we crashed down onto the obverse slope, where we knew nothing about the forces ranged against us. We plowed to a halt on a slope of loose stones. My cupola periscopes were cracked and dusty, making forward vision difficult. When I was sure that we were below the skyline, so that I was less of a target for snipers, I went up through the cupola to see what was in front of us. Dawn was close, that much was evident. Not the false, blinding dawn of the power searchlights, but a blue mark across the sky. Below us, red infantry were retreating, running from us over the earthworks which we Germans had built to defend the zone. In the distance, as the land fell away to the east, I saw a corridor of flames and explosions, which surely marked the limit of the 12th Army's advance. If we could make it to that corridor, we would have a chance of making it onward to the Elbe. The dawn light rose as the remaining vehicles and infantry of our assault group reared up over the railroad lines and slithered down the slope. None of the Stugs had survived. One Wirbelwind was intact, and another joined us as a chassis tractor, with its open turret blasted away. The SS King Tiger labored over the ridge in the gray light, with flames licking around its engine bay. The huge machine shuddered and ground to a halt, its tracks sinking into the loose stones as its crew extinguished the flames. The infantry had survived at a rate of perhaps 40% or less. The Fallschirmjäger came in ones and twos over the railroad, shouldering their guns, and with their faces set under masks of dust. The Volkssturm people came, supporting each other, trailing their Panzerfausts behind them, boys carrying the old men and vice versa. The Wehrmacht troops came over with their Kettenhund gang behind them, the soldiers reduced to a platoon and their escorts down to 2 men. With this ragged bunch of men and machines, we had crossed the last barrier that remained before the Elbe and our salvation. But what of the capo? Despite the urgency, I ran back over the railroad to look for him. The capo's Panther was stuck fast on the eastern side of the ridge. Its tracks ripped off and its transmission burned out. In 5 minutes we had drained its fuel and ammunition and added them to my Panther, and then we blew the Panther up with a demolition charge. I looked back to see the engine blown out through the grills. Around it, a great mass of people was already starting to make its way west. The thousands of foot soldiers, stragglers, and civilians that had emerged from the Kessel overnight. I installed the capo and his crew on my Panther, and we followed the single King Tiger as it spearheaded. The way to the west, behind us, the sprawling column followed at a running pace. Horses, carts, men and women on foot, and numerous motorcycles, a few cars, and Hanemags. I could not count the people, but I guessed at 4,000 or 5,000. That I could see, with many more evidently still behind them. For many of these people, though, their journey was about to end. As the dawn broke, the sky behind us to the east erupted in red. Not the red of sunrise, but the orange and black explosions of Katyusha incendiary rockets The explosions were tearing across the mass of people advancing over. The railroad, sending men, women, and children flying through the air in flames, throwing horses, wagons, and vehicles end over end in spouts of fire. The people. Close to the railroad began to run like demons, the wounded dragging. Themselves, soldiers throwing away their guns, civilians becoming trampled in. The mob. The breakout was being sealed by the bombardment with a line of pure fire that prevented any further Germans coming west. Before I turned away, I saw a single horse charge through the wall of flames, streaming fire, his rider dead in the saddle. Nothing else came through that curtain of death except pieces of debris and burning liquid, those few thousand of us that had crossed the railroad quickly, accelerated, fleeing the incendiary bombardment, knowing that each moment made it more likely that we would be caught in the firestorm like those we left behind.